Hello, everybody. Hope you're okay. Apologies. Just if you could, everyone give us about 2-3 minutes to get everything started. I'm in the Maersk office. I've not brought the right battery pack, so we need to sort this ASAP. Soren has kindly gone to try and help me find a battery. Amazing stuff. If everyone could just give us 2 minutes, Soren's ready to go. We're going to have a fantastic discussion. So we will start the conversation in 2 minutes. Cheers.
Cool.
There we go. There we go. Perfect. I am all batteried up and I'm with the wonderful Soren here. I'll do my introduction, tell you a bit about what we're trying to do today. And then today really is about Soren discussing MLOps at Maersk and his experience around that in terms of culture. So, context today. We're Evolution. We provide tech freelancers across the Nordics with a focus on Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Stockholm. Part of doing that, and the way we do that, is to add value to those communities by providing leading edge content, speaking with thought leaders, and making sure we're adding value to the communities we're actually ultimately dealing with. On the right hand side, there's going to be a chat function. We will endeavor to try and give everyone a chance to ask questions. If we don't end up answering any of those questions, we'll actually come back to it, and I'll pop an email over to Soren after, and we'll try and send those across in the group that you'll all be led to after. But apart from that, yeah, if you could try and engage with it as much as possible. I've got some questions already lined up for Soren. And yeah, feel free to comment if anything is of interest. So let's make sure everyone can comment. That's perfect. Soren, how are you doing?
Doing wonderfully. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
Very good indeed. Just enjoying my Maersk mug. I'm
Indeed.
live in Copenhagen. We're in the same room. So, Soren, I suppose for hopefully there'll be some listeners that actually already know you. We've got 70 people signed up, so a really nice audience. But for people who don't know you, could you give us your introduction, please?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Søren. I am heading up two teams here in the Maersk organization currently. One is the data science and experimentation team on Maersk.com. That team is building experimentation capabilities as well as general experimentation capabilities for the experiments that we run on that platform, as well as personalization. So customer level data signals, but also recommendation models and things of that nature. The other team is a sister team to the first one. It's for another digital platform that we have called Twill, which targets a specific customer segment, namely the small cargo owning customers. They are the closest to say a B2C type setup, and so as you guys will have probably experienced from your own interactions being on the other side of B2C setups, there is a different set of say needs as a customer in those situations. However, once we think about the data science part of things and the data part of things, it's actually quite related to the setup in the first team. As I said, I'm heading up these teams, and so my day to day is a lot about thinking about how can we best add value, what are we trying to where we're trying to get to, and of course unblock, help the team accelerate and things of those natures. I am an engineer and a scientist by training, and so I've been doing like the actual coding for quite some years, and have more recently shifted over more to management roles. I think what that perhaps offers me, and also for the context of this conversation, is I have experience with both sides of the table.
And Soren, well, there's a few people at Evolution that spoke to you before, Soren. Why was this a passion of yours?
No, that's a very good question. So I'll use a personal story to motivate this. So initially, I studied engineering, I studied science, stuck around, did a PhD, and what eventually I found was that I really felt a need to create impact in the real world, and I ended up shifting away from the academic side, coming over to industry, and have, as I said before, worked in industry now for whatever 10 years almost. One of the driving factors for me was that in academia you do a lot of beautiful things, theories, models, but making impact with those, having those actually help other people or be put in situations where people derive value from that, was what I was missing. And that's also what I see here with MLOps. Obviously, having worked in the space for a while, I think those of us who've done so know that building a model is actually the easiest part, but taking that to a production setup where people can rely on it is requires a lot of additional effort. So to me, it sort of mirrors personal interest and sort of deep personal motivation. So that's why this particular domain is one which I'm very passionate about.
Okay, and I suppose for people who might have joined us and don't know what MLOps is, what is it? Why is it important?
So that's a great question, right? So um, MLOps, very bluntly, is saying is machine learning operations. It's an abbreviation, and it is the combination. In my definition, at least, it's a combination of mindset and practices to do machine learning for production. So similar to how you have a DevOps, and which is another say combination of mindset and tooling. MLOps is the same, or say the extended version of DevOps, but targeting machine learning. Now that was just a very say basic definition of what is MLOps. The second part of your question of why is it important? I think I'll take a step back. I'll say the most important thing. I think many organizations have come to this realization over the past decade or so is that, as I said at the top, building a model is actually pretty easy, right? It's in the sense that from an actual development perspective, that's easy. The hard part is how do we take that model? How do we put that into production? How do we consistently? How can we? What are the things we need to do to ensure that we can rely on this for whatever outcome it is that we're trying to do? Like these models, we build them because we want to either make a prediction about the future or to inform decisions, right? So really to any institution, whether that's a company, whether that's a government agency, frankly, whether that's an academic setting, the real question very, very quickly is going to be, in order for you to develop or to drive value, is can I rely on that output from that model, right? MLOps is the set of tools, mindsets, and principles that allow you to answer yes to that question, right? Now, um, what do you need to do, or why is it then I guess the follow-up question of why is it important is, well, obviously if you don't, it's hard to then actually rely on to know with any degree of certainty that you can rely on these models, right? I'll double click on what I said before about being a mindset and a set of tools. I think that's also an important part of this. um, the mindset part is that you need to be able to rely on your models. And where I think where we see tensions in this is that organizations can get caught up in thinking the hard part is building the model. We need to get people that know how to build models, which is true. That is certainly a rate limiting factor and a bottleneck if you don't have those capabilities. But what you're going to find over time is that if you don't have the right setup that allows you to take those models to production, to understand whether or not you can rely on them, monitor that performance, you're not going to be able to actually trust. Nobody's in your organization is going to be able to trust that the outputs from the models are actually trustworthy or actually something that we can truly rely on, and therefore the whole initiative very quickly loses value unless we can put up bounds and guarantees on those parts.
Why then, Soren, do you think the conversation seems to be dominated by the tech side of MLOps, even on the ground level and even at the sea level sometimes? Why is it dominated by tech rather than focusing on culture?
So that's a really good question. Um, I guess so obviously what I'm about to say is a very personal opinion. I think it's because it's still fluffy, it's still uncertain to most organization. Like the whole machine learning thing is hard, is intangible, right? You get these people, you call them data scientists, machine learning engineers, and they do it, right? And that's kind of the point, I think, or the meta point is that if you're taking people who are in typically individual contributor engineering type roles and asking them to also be responsible for everything else, then obviously they're going to bring a certain biased perspective to that conversation. So back to your question of why is it say a technical or typically driven by a technical conversation or a technical parts of the organization. I think that's because typically that's where you see the most maturity with these types of technologies. And I think we shouldn't discourage the fact or doesn't discount the fact that most people that are in these roles, data scientist roles, are obviously very focused on creating quality products that serve their customers. They understand the importance of building these capabilities, but they sometimes, I think, have a hard time articulating to their senior leaders why this is important. And I'll be very honest. I've been in these situations myself, right? It can be there's a very significant difference in frame of reference speaking to fellow engineers versus senior executives who are concerned with something very different, right? They're concerned with driving whatever objectives they have, whether that be increased sales or customer acquisition or whatever the case may be, right? So I think there's simply a learning barrier, or sorry, a language barrier on the one side, and secondly, there's again a lack of maturity or not yet well enough developed maturity uh, across both sides for understanding how machine learning requires specific or special treatment to be taken to production.
Do you think there's an element of getting caught up in the hype of even the abbreviation ML, AI, adding ops to it, bringing it together? Do you think, especially I'm in recruitment and I see companies wanting to just put the phrase MLOps or AI in their job specs, do you think we're still getting caught up in it and it's masking what's the really important issues, the people, the culture within that?
I think so, and I think there's even so what I would argue is that often the biggest challenge with anything ML, even an ML adjacent, let's say anything adjacent to this domain, analytics most very broadly defined, is that we often start from, very often at least, you can start from the question of saying, what there must be value in the data that we have. What is the value we can derive? Let's get people who know how to do that, right? And then we throw in more and more buzzwords, and obviously that can be great, at least in the short term. But then you very quickly hit this challenge that says, well, we identify pockets of value, but how do we actually embed that into our, again, organization in such a way that we can really drive value? And often, again, because what these technologies do is they either automate or improve or enhance decision making processes. And so you quickly come back to this point that I made before, that you need to be able to rely on that to really drive that value. And to me, that really is a product question, most of all, to say, how can we ensure that throughout the entire lifetime and the entire span of that product, are we doing the right thing? Are we delivering the value? And I think this product mindset towards these analytics products is often the missing link. At least again, based on personal experience, this is the maturity journey that I've seen in a couple of different instances. That the further along you get on that journey as an organization, the better you are at understanding how to articulate your needs. And then, as you grow in your maturity, you also realize that often the technology choices are typically secondary, right? It's about how do we set ourselves up to be able to deliver that value. So again, I think, and you mentioned this thing about being, let's say, very dependent or sometimes like using certain buzzwords, et cetera, right? I think um, again, when you are not fully matured, you don't really know what's important and what's not, and I guess you tend to then use the buzzwords so you can attract the very talented people who know what that means, and hopefully they can teach you, right?
You totally right. There's still an element of you've got to let these people be excited in what they're doing and then bring it back to actually why we're doing this and setting a culture. So Really interesting conversation already, so I appreciate your input. You mentioned some of the senior stakeholders before, yeah, and how you speak to them. With ML, um, with MLOps environments, yeah, machine learning models, throwing that into production, how do we ensure quality?
So that again is a super good question, right? So I think perhaps the way to think about this and perhaps just formulate sort of the whole MLOps thing a little more concretely, or just to define that a little bit. I think what's important to think about is what are the capabilities that you need for your ML setup to be able to deliver these things, right? And what I see at least is that you need to be able to, like, fundamentally, the things you need to be able to do is you need to be able to uh, experiment in production with your models, right? You need to be able to take your models, put them into production, learn from that whether or not the model works, and then either roll back or keep going, right? Which sort of have the additional capability requirement that you need to be able to iterate quickly. Right now, finally, you also need to be able to understand performance. How are you doing? Is it consistently high? Is it reducing? So you have that feedback mechanism in there as well. Like these to me are the basic capabilities that you need to do. Once you have that, or once you can agree to that, and people will likely see it differently than I do on some of these parameters, then that sort of feeds to your next level of what are then the steps, or the actual things that you need to be able to support. And that to me is that you need to be able to retrain easily. So you need to have automation in place that does that. You need to be able to have to understand your data generating process and control that well enough that you can ensure some, ideally pretty high levels of consistency in how that data comes in. You need to be able to, after you've retrained, you need to be able to push that model to a production state really quickly. You need to be able to manage and configure and orchestrate all the different components of the system. You need to be able to monitor the performance. You need to be able to know, once you're serving it, what's the actual performance you're getting in terms of comparing what is the actual value that eventually materialized for whatever the data point you're trying to say something about, versus what did you predict or infer from your model. And then you need to be able to automate those feedback mechanisms so that whatever discrepancy you have, you can feed that back to a retraining setup, right?
Sorry, there'll be a lot of our listeners right now, some would be working for larger organizations like the Maersk of the world. Some would be working at startups, some SMEs in between. How is that process there? I mean, first of all, you say, listen, you need to be able to make mistakes. Yeah, ML and mistakes going together. Some C-level people have already turned off and they're not watching the show anymore, right? Some people would be scared of that, right? How do you think what you've talked about there works across startups to SMEs to Maersk?
So I don't have direct startup experience myself. So whatever I can offer there will be anecdotal at best. Let me just get that out of the way. Now, I think a lot of this comes down to how critical is the initiative to the mission of the organization. I think generally that more than the actual size of the company determines how you're able to have those conversations with your senior leaders. If this is one of those things where it's like, we have a lot of data, we think there might be value, let's go play. I think that doesn't sound like something that's super high on the agenda, right? So eventually that will lose interest unless you find these nuggets or these hidden value pockets that you were not aware of. And in that case, I think it's probably hard to sustain the interest of your senior leaders. Uh, Flipping the question around, saying when do you then sustain that interest? That is, again, to me, what I called the product question before, is making sure, whenever you're working on these problems which are fundamental to what the company is trying to achieve, or at least is contributing to significant goals of the company. That's when you're probably going to see continued investment and interest from your senior executives. And I imagine that's the case both for smaller companies, startup, whether they're startup, they're scale ups, or even towards larger organizations. And certainly, what I can reflect on here at Maersk is that, um, for context, Maersk is a traditional shipping company, but has made very significant investments to building out a very strong technology function over the past 5-6 years, with the aspiration, I think, articulated aspiration to be as strong on the digital side as we are on the actual physical execution of transportation and logistics. And here, for us, the stuff that we do because that directly contributes to the overall mission of the company. And so our senior leaders are very much focused on holding us accountable for the outcomes that we're delivering. And so for us, uh, MLOps and other initiatives, for that matter, are being scrutinized by senior leaders at regular cadences. So actually, they don't care about MLOps; they care about our models being good, which we then which we then take back and say, if that is to happen, especially if it is to happen for all the models we're trying to build across the company, we need to have centralized capabilities that support that.
And as you mentioned there, centralized, yeah, could you see MLOps being incorporated into every team, or do you just keep it as a central hub at the moment? Sorry.
Oh, so this is a really interesting question. I think uh, I can reflect on sort of the journey that we've been on as a company, right? Going back some years, right? There, let's say the as we have evolved in our digital maturity, we've had an expanding number of teams who have undertaken machine learning and say analytics, again broadly defined activities that have some reliance on machine learning, and therefore starts getting into the space where we need to retrain and where MLOps becomes relevant. Uh, that has been very much like the focus has been driven very much by deliverables within those specific functional areas. So, for instance, like landside transport, which is basically like for us, landside transportation is a different area to ocean transportation, for instance. Some of the landside teams have developed some solutions that have naturally depended on machine learning. The same for ocean, et cetera, et cetera. And initially, those were developed in pockets. And with that, you say the maturity and the general understanding within the company has evolved, and we're now getting to a point where we see that there are so many teams who are starting to do this that it becomes a simple economies of scale question, saying that there's a lot of benefit to centralizing your initiatives. But I think it's sort of been a natural evolution, and I imagine that you could take other approaches to this as a company. Of course, if you have a very strong vision that this is a particular domain that you want to grow in very like for strategic reasons, of course you could go ahead and build the capabilities to begin with. Um, but again, I think it also depends on a lot of additional say factors for your particular company and setup.
So could you see Maersk moving to an almost embedded model where it's necessary, or do you see big centralized team in the future? Which do you reckon you're more
So
leaning
I
towards?
think that's another great question. I think this is I would separate capability, the MLOps capability from the team setup. And I think the MLOps capability we are likely going to centralize because there's a scale benefit from that. Whereas uh, the uh, the teams themselves, I think, will remain close to the actual problems they're trying to solve. And so, think of it similar to how you would in many. I think many of our listeners will probably be of technical backgrounds and will know of how you typically leverage things like a CI/CD type setup for project development pipelines, right? Most companies have a single framework for that all teams will depend on, and that's kind of the mindset that I think we will evolve to for MLOps, where we have a centralized system to support or a centralized framework to support this, but being deployed by or employed by individual teams.
You don't need to go into detail, but how have the results been? Is it working? Is it just talk us through that?
Um, that's a really interesting question, right? So I have my observations and my experiences. I would stress that other teams surely have their own observations and will likely give you a different perspective when asked. I think that's an important meta message in any case. Um, when I first started doing this almost 10 years ago, we had nothing related to MLOps, right? So this was the the Wild West, the early jungle. There is some data that's what you can drive from that. I happened to be on a project uh, that where we were delivering something that had business value, and so the actual productionization challenge became one that we had to face pretty quickly after I actually started doing the work. And there was nothing, there was no support of any kind. It was really just our own, let's say, ambitions to build things that mattered and that continued to work, that drove us to then cut corners and try to build out some of these capabilities using the best of our abilities at the time. And also, mind you, this was almost 10 years ago, so the available tool stack was much less sophisticated than what you see now. Um, Over time, right, I've seen how in the company we have matured more and more. And then again, as I mentioned, we've seen that developments in different pockets has sort of emerged and mushroomed, and we've been able to leverage those developments. And so as we now proceed, I see we're essentially going to centralize more and more of this. Um, from the perspective of the teams that are involved, and now I have to sort of switch to manager gear because I'm not hands-on anymore. But for the perspective of the teams, the ambition is very much that this becomes much easier, much less of a hassle. You shouldn't need to have a full team that supports your dedicated infrastructure tool stack, etc., for you to, as a team, deploy your machine learning models. So essentially, think of it as having more and more of a scaffold you can stand on when you're doing this, where you can just focus on the actual modeling part, except for everything else.
I'm just looking at the questions that are coming in, and thanks everyone for typing the questions. I'll try and ask Soren some of them anyway. But even the questions coming in, it seems ML ops is, I mean, half the questions coming in are on ethical considerations, morality, ethical, and the other half from which tech. Yeah. Just before like we go into these questions, and you and me really wanted to focus on the culture, how did you manage to, and you might have already answered this, but I'm really keen on understanding, how did you manage to um, sound out the noise of the ethics of that, the cool tech that's being used, and really come down to culture being the most important part of this?
So this would have been great if I just had like a answer like this, right? And I don't. I think the clearly this is a super hard question. And what I also need to stress here is that in Maersk, we actually have a team that focuses on data ethics in general, which we've been collaborating with, and who also, by the way, have taken a very strong role in making sure that we are supporting those considerations as well. So I certainly cannot take any credit for that particular part. Um, Having said that, I think we've been fortunate that we've had people who have done this before, and we've had teams that have been successful in deploying it. So that gives you actually, automatically gives you much more credibility in these conversations. We've tried to bring in everybody who had opinions and help and sort of form and shape a way forward. But to your point, it is uh, what you will find is typically that at least in an organization of the shape and diversity, the shape of our, sorry, the size of ours, with the diversity of projects and problems teams are trying to solve, what one team considers very important is going to be very different from another. Let me give you a very concrete example that I think a lot of our listeners will probably be familiar with. Different models, different types of machine learning models will need to be served in different ways. Some things you can just produce a batch outcome once a day and let other teams consume that. That's something like a forecast, for instance, right? People typically don't need 5-minute updates every 5 minutes on the forecast. It can happen once a day or once a week or whatever is a natural cadence for that particular case. On the other hand, if you're thinking about a recommendation system that's live on a website, right? That recommendation system you need to be able to ping that, and it needs to be able to come back with a response to what do we recommend for customer X and situation Y within milliseconds, right? So that's a very different type of solution. This is in both of these are in the serving layer. So do you do a batch serving or an online serving? If you look at teams that have been focused solely on batch learning, the problems they have had in an MLOps setting will not be catering necessarily to this online serving part. Conversely, people who have been working solely on the online serving part may have neglected some of the things that, say, a large scale forecasting setup will have required, right? So we've tried to get everybody together and provide this input, but also try to sort of weed out what is that common skeleton that would still support a variety of use cases. Secondly, perhaps to the other part of the question, we recognize, and coming back to the culture aspects. So culture is, there's multiple levels of culture also, right? You have culture in terms of tech folks versus managers or senior executives or people who bring more of a business perspective. But then you also have cultures like within different teams, right? Different teams have different sets of requirements, as I talked about before, and that can vary easily. And you also spoke to this thing about, you can have perhaps sometimes entrenched debates over one tool versus the other. What we're trying to do here is say we essentially think about this as an open, we call it inner source, but like open source for internal use, where everybody can come in, contribute their ideas. If it improves the overall system, well, we just go with it, right? We add that to the stack and we continue.
So, MLOps team, yeah, for people who think it's some alien world, you give us some insight. Is it, if you walked in a room and saw a standard agile software engineering team and an MLOps team, what would be the differences?
Are you just to be clear, you're thinking about like the team to develop the framework or a team that's leveraging a framework?
A bit of both, really. I'm just talking about MLOps. Yeah,
Okay.
again, it's got this. Everyone's quite excited. Where's the MLOps team? Yeah, are you super agile? Yeah, have you got your Kanban boards? Yeah, is it just another area? And I'm also interested in terms of, and there's a couple of questions on this. Is what type of people do you recruit into MLOps? Is it people with 4 or 5 years MLOps experience, or are you looking for a certain type of person? So what's it like on a day-to-day basis as a team? Is there any differences to a software engineering team, right, that you can see doing processes, agile, etc.? And then likewise, how do people get into an MLOps team?
Okay, so this is an interesting conversation, and again, unfortunately, or interesting question, and again, unfortunately, I have to stress, I'm actually not running our MLOps team, so I'm only sort of a bystander to that, but I'll try to explain what as much as I can. I think an important first sort of distinction is to say that agile and ML or MLOps, those are two complete different, let's say, orthogonal or at least different axes to evaluate on. You can surely have product teams that develop machine learning products and MLOps teams that follow that would follow either an agile or a non-agile setup, whether that's waterfall or something completely third, right? So I think that's the first distinction that needs to be very clear. Now, in MLOps, I stressed before the ability to iterate quickly. Right, so that obviously speaks to an agile setup, but I think to me it's more about how do you de-risk whatever you're trying to do as much as possible, right? Again, some would argue that's part of the agile mindset for sure, but I think I could also see where you could use this in a waterfall setup, but even try to use these types of approaches to de-risk whatever you're trying to do. Now, that was kind of one just sort of preface to the answer. On to the actual question. What would a team look like? I think if we're thinking about a product team, then this would, depending on what you're building, this would typically be a cross-functional product team comprised of software engineers, data engineers, data scientists, or machine learning engineers, and a product manager, so that the team can be end-to-end responsible. I think that's the ideal setup. And again, this is personal preference, not something that's written in stone. So to become a member or to get into such a team and be a member that a technical contributor that builds out these products, you need to have skills in some of those domains and be able to function in such a team. So similar to other setups. Now, coming back and then over to the final part of your question about what would an MLOps team look like. And this is where I need to stress that I am not in the team, and so this will be more anecdotal in nature. But MLOps tooling really is similar to other internal tools in the sense that this is a lot about assuming there's something you're partly building yourself and not just relying on what's available out of the box in some of the major cloud providers. you will have a team that needs to build and orchestrate a tool stack that will run on some infrastructure. And so to make things easy, what you will typically need to have happen is that your teams need to be able to easily access the data, easily need to be able to explore it, build a model, and push that to a production type setup. They need to be able to track performance, needs to be able to have these, the CI/CD automations and all that sort of stuff. Need to be able to define retraining. Um, a lot of this really comes down to how do you build good integrations and are able to maintain state and stuff like that throughout this different part. Now, this was a little bit long-winded, but the people who are typically best at doing this are software engineers and data engineers, um, as far as I can tell. But I'm sure there's a lot of data scientists that are really strong and could do this as well. Um, but I think the mindset there is a little different because at least in a pure MLOps team, what you're building is infrastructure for other people to use. And so there's also a question of, do you find that motivating and interesting?
Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. I think you touched on this earlier. Yeah. And I don't know whether we've evolved in this process, but how should companies, what was it, about 5 years ago, people using ML models, AI strategies, just because they thought they needed to, right? It was literally people had budgets for it as well, which was crazy. I remember at the time people asking us for consultants, and they didn't really know what they wanted them for. Next 2 months later, our consultants were like, "I don't really know what I'm doing here," right? And it seems like we've evolved into a much more mature model. But how do companies, how should they be measuring the success of their ML models and teams?
That's another great question. So I think if we completely just remove the ML part and just say you have a team that's building a product, that product is trying to solve a problem. I think that's essentially the toy model to be that we need to work with here. Under that construct, the problem, whatever it may be, will typically have some objectives it's trying to reach, and this obviously ties into the whole say product maturity and go to market plan, whatever that the product management team for that product has developed. Um, Along from that, you should very easily be able to derive some outcomes you're trying to push forward with ideally some targets, and that's how I would look at measuring the success. So again, to give you a concrete example, um, what could we think of? Again, we can think of probably a recommendation system somewhere, right? Uh, I'm not necessarily drawing on specific experiences from within Maersk, but I think even if you look to Amazon or something, companies who've been doing this for 20 years, what I'm about to say, I'm sure also applies to them. Right? These companies, why do they build? Why do we have recommendation systems on Amazon in the first place? We do so because Amazon has basically an almost infinite catalog that surely runs in the millions of items, probably also in the tens of millions of items, and there's no way any of us is going to know how to get to exactly the item that we need if we just go to their website and start searching, right? So they've figured out that there was sort of a big issue with getting people to the stuff that they needed, right? And so recommendation systems are really a way to try to infer customer interest in that situation from essentially what other customers have from the actions other customers have done. Now, if we again abstract away the machine learning part and say, what do you have? Well, you have a black box, and that black box says, I'm trying to essentially increase sales or increase likelihood that a session ends in a sale. From that, you could directly derive a success metric. Let's just take the second one on likelihood that it ends in a sale. Then you can look at how many sessions end in a sale, and you should be able to see that number or that fraction increases over time as you deploy your machine learning. In this case, your recommender system.
But is this in the assumption that the ML model will produce and achieve a higher result? Yeah. So if we're going for X using the current way of doing it, but we're thinking about introducing ML, is that like a sign that you could double the target, for example? Yeah. Or can we use some of the old stuff?
So I would say ML is just one tool in the box, right? There can be a whole bunch of other tools, and picking the right tool to help you increase whatever metric or drive forward whichever metric you're interested in. That really is part of this what I call the product management question, right? Which is understand the problem overall, get as deep as you can in understanding the dynamics within the problem, and then from there deduce what are the steps that are most likely to move the needle in the direction that you want, ideally move the needle the most, right? Um, so I guess another thing we could have done, another thing Amazon could have done, right, is you could have had a very, 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 very large workforce of customer service agents. You could call up and say, I'm looking for a book. And that book is, I want a book about, I don't know, how to cook alligators, to pick something completely random, right? And then they can say, okay, well, we have this one that's called Cajun food. So do you want that? And you can say, okay, right? And then you can say, and then they could say afterwards, okay, well, people who've also bought Cajun food, they have also this cookbook on Cajun food have also bought, I don't know, Cajun seasoning. Do you want that as well? Right? That would be a different way of solving the same problem, right? Or at least it would be a different way of trying to increase this overall metric, which is how do we improve or increase the number of sessions that ends in a sale, if you will. Right. So it's a question of you're going to have multiple different ways of solving the problem, and of course you need to pick the one that you believe is most feasible across the dimensions of customer satisfaction and tech feasibility, and also can we build something that customers actually want to interact with.
It's quite interesting you bring up Amazon, because I need to have a chat with Jeff, because my missus seems to be ordering about five things a day at the minute. So whatever ML model they've been doing, it's been working in my household. Okay, sorry, we're coming up to probably the end of the questions, but just give us an insight. I want to ask two questions. One about what you love as someone in a leadership position in ML, right? And then secondly, if anyone's listening out here that thinks, I like this Søren guy, or I like what Maersk are doing, how would they get in touch? So, first question, what do you enjoy about being in a leadership position in AI ML?
So I think I mentioned this at the top of the call, but I'll just repeat it. So for me, what I found that I really like to do, and this was something that I had to sort of experience, but that was that I like to develop technologies that have an impact, and I like to use I like to take more advanced technologies and make them have an impact in real life. That can be super challenging, it can be super frustrating, but in the end, that's what I've found that I enjoy doing the most. And so ML is and machine learning and these types of problems are sort of they touch on those specific interests. Secondly, what I also like to do is I like to try to help people as much as possible, whether that be the users or the people who develop it. So sort of my, if you will, a little bit of a personal mission is that I like to develop technologies that create an outsized impact for both the users as well as the people that develop it. And so that to me is why I find that this being in this space, also in a leadership position, sort of works very well with that sort of personal ambition. Um, Another thing that I've also come to appreciate about it is that you can have this very diverse day where you can spend an hour in the morning talking about you know metrics and how you improve your MLOps based on the metrics. And you can go have a conversation about something pretty profound on Bayesian statistics, and then you go talk about people stuff and how do we unblock teams and how do we best set ourselves up to support to develop something in that domain. So for somebody who has sort of a multitude of interests that roughly or overlap with these types of topics, I think that's this type of role also enables that. And then I think finally I really do take a lot of um, I get a lot of energy from helping other people, and I find that um, I don't know that this particular domain is different in a leadership position than other domains would be in a leadership position, but the types of questions we're also debating here, navigating culture, navigating say product versus tech, and all this sort of stuff. That's I find that challenging and energizing at the same time.
And then finally, if anyone's listening, they like a bit of Soren, they like a bit of Maersk, they want to get themselves one of these lovely cups or sit in this lovely office, what would they do? What type of people do you look for?
Great question. So in general, we're looking for skilled, capable problem solvers. So in technical roles, we're looking for people who are strong technically, but who also really like to solve problems, who can think on their feet and move fast. We do hire, and I'll encourage anybody to go and check out our openings, Maersk.com, I think vacancies. But otherwise, just hit Maersk.com. That's Maersk.com. And that should be able to easily navigate to our career page. We do hire across I think our primary across the globe, but our primary locations are in Denmark, Maidenhead in the UK, India, and we really are looking, I think, at any point in time for a number of different individuals, data science, ML engineering, but also software engineering, uh, data engineering for that matter, and also in adjacent fields such as product and uh, uh, you know other sorts of roles, either squarely or squarely within or adjacent to the domains that we touch here today.
And just to add to that, the office is amazing. And I've been to not that I'm at the Oslo Plaid's office at the minute, but I've been to one of the other offices and the canteen. I think there's more people working at that canteen the whole of Evolution Recruitment. It's absolutely incredible. So if yeah, two ways of applying for Maersk there. Awesome food or really interesting projects. Obviously, my little thing at the end, the QR code is here. So if you're a company, if you sat there going, we need an extra pair of hands, and you need a freelancer, scan the QR code, fill out the form. That will be directed to me, and I'll pop you an email probably tomorrow because after this, I've got another meetup to go to, and I'm watching the football tonight. So awesome. Just want to say massive thanks to Søren, who sat over there. Thank you so much for attending and speaking to our audience. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them in, and I will send them over to Søren, and we'll endeavor to try and get some more answers. Thank you so much for listening. I think 75 people end up attending this, so thank you. Really appreciate this. If you want to listen back, it'll be on our Danish podcast, which the link will be provided. So feel free to do that. And if you want to share it with anyone, there'll be options to share. Thank you so much. Thank you, Søren. You're amazing. And goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye, guys.